All right. Well, yeah, like and subscribe this. We're talking about digital imaging, spatial. I can't do that with a straight face. Spatial resolution. So the objectives that I've got for us here during this presentation are, and I'm having some issues here with my, there we go, is understand, we'll review basically that distinction between analog and digital. A few folks have been emailing about it, and I want to make sure we're real clear on that before we move forward. That mostly what we're working with is going to be digital data, not analog data, and why that distinction exists. Then we'll talk about pixels and image matrix and how those characteristics work together to form the spatial resolution of the image. And then we'll talk about pixel size, matrix size, field of view, and how they relate to each other. So one thing to understand is when we're talking about, so the name of this lecture is spatial resolution. So the big umbrella term is resolution, right? And it basically means, can I see it, yes or no? Underneath it, though, there's two subdivisions at least. There's spatial resolution. Can I see it in space? And then there's contrast resolution. Can I see it in terms of color, right? So sometimes we talk about spatial resolution as being high contrast resolution. Those terms are interrelated, interchangeable. We can talk about spatial resolution and high contrast resolution. They're essentially the same thing. Sometimes when we talk about contrast resolution, we might refer to it also as low contrast resolution. Those terms are interchangeable. I don't want you to get tripped up by that if you see that somewhere else in another textbook or what have you. It is particularly used frequently in writing about CT, that in CT it has a high specificity for low contrast resolution, meaning it has a good contrast resolution, right? Yeah.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
You said low contrast resolution is also what?
Low contrast resolution, we could just call contrast resolution.
Okay.
But looking at that little tiny pixelated skeleton, we can see that there's very little diagnostic value on that last slide with the little tiny pixel skeleton. Not a lot can be looked at and diagnosed from that. So the question is, how do we get something better than a little pixelated skeleton, right? That's the question of spatial resolution. So before we wade into these waters, though, I want to make sure that we're clear on this analog versus digital, and this is a slide from our last discussion. So I talked about how analog is something like this continuous scale, like the column A, versus digital is something like this discrete scale of, looks like a ladder on column B. An example that comes from our textbook that might be helpful is thinking about it as different types of watches or different types of clocks. So if you have an old school watch, right, where the second hand's continuously moving, right, that would be an analog way of thinking. It's continuously moving. It's showing not only every single second, it's showing everything that could be between all of those seconds. Versus like a digital watch like this one, it only shows that it is 8:33:07, 8:33:08, right? So it's broken down into these discrete units of time. Where that's helpful and how this applies to our pictures is that it has to break down the information in the patient's body into discrete units of spatial information. So every part of the patient's body is going to be represented by what we call a picture element, right? That term's been shortened to a pixel. So pixel's the short term for picture element. Every part of the patient's body is going to be broken down into a tiny discrete little dot. Right? It's actually a square. So this is the smallest element of a digital image, is a pixel. If we magnify this picture here, we can see the little pixels there at the base of this, looks like an oil rig or something. For us, in trying to figure out how do we move from the little pixelated skeleton to something that has diagnostic value, a big part of that has to do with pixel size. So the little clumpy looking skeleton has a very large pixel size, right? As we shrink the pixel size smaller and smaller and smaller, we are getting better and better spatial resolution. So what we're asking is, how do I represent the patient's body as little tiny squares that are very small? Because if I do that, I will have good spatial resolution. I'll have good high contrast resolution. Yes?
This is the part that has me confused. I understand the more pixels we have, the better the picture because they're smaller. So when you talk about magnification, that's what the picture on the left, you're going to have.
Good. So
spatial resolution?
the question is, which of these would be the magnified image, right? And she's right. As we zoom in on the picture, what we're having to do is to grow the pixels out. So spatially what we're doing as we're zooming in, we're actually just making the pixels larger. And it appears to the human eye that we're getting closer, right? You could think about it like this, like you're meeting someone in a dark bar, right? And across the bar, this person looks really good, right? But the closer and closer you get to them, the more and more detail you see, and all of a sudden you start to see all the warts and the wrinkles or whatever, right? So that's the same thing's happening. It's literally happening with the human eye, that as you get closer to something in real space, everything about that thing starts to get bigger. Now the problem with a digital image is everything that you're making bigger is little tiny squares. In reality, as I get closer and closer to something, what I'm making bigger is little tiny atoms. And I cannot see an atom, so I cannot exhaust the detail that I'll be able to see, right? Unless I get down to some microscopic level. I know that's kind of weird. We will be returning to it over and over and over again. For our purposes right now, I'm talking about spatial resolution. So I will definitely come back and I'll readdress magnification and what's happening when we magnify digital images. But for the pixel size purposes, the best way that I can think about relating it to, for the purposes of our images, is matrix size. Now, we cannot control the matrix size of our digital imaging systems. It's something that's hardwired into the system, that CT has a 512 by 512 matrix. Mammo has huge matrix sizes. General X-ray is somewhere between CT and Mammo. This matrix size has a bearing on the pixel size. So in terms of pixel size, like I said, it directly relates to spatial resolution. The smaller the pixel, the higher the spatial resolution. Pixel sizes can change. You have the power to change the size of the pixels in the images that you're taking. The main way that you can do that is by changing your field of view. Because matrix is fixed. The systems that you're working on have a fixed matrix size. It's some binary number, right? The field of view, though, you can change. You can window, or you can collimate more or less. And as you decrease that field of view, you are decreasing your pixel size. And so you're improving spatial resolution. So not only, on a digital system, what I'm saying is, not only does decreasing the field of view or the exposure area improve, it reduces patient dose, it improves image contrast. I'm also saying for a digital system it reduces pixel size, so it enhances spatial resolution. Now, all of that is pretty cut and dry because it's all geometrical. I can look at that and I can say, okay, that pixel represents, that little square represents this part of the patient's sternum or whatever, this part of the patient's heart. So it ties to something that I understand about anatomy, it ties to things that I understand about pathology, all of that. It's the way that I look at the world. When I walk around in the world, I'm thinking about the shape of things, right? That's how I survive in this world. I make sure that I don't hit another car. Why? Because I see that car in space, right? In relationship to me. I don't mean like outer space. I mean, I've got a space that my body lives in and my car is driving through, and they've got a space that their body lives in and their car is driving through. This thing, bit depth, is different. This is a computer thing, right? This is not something that I can look at and say, that's the way I think about things, because it's not, right? I do not think about things this way. But what's nice is since you've had this training as an X-ray tech, you have a really ready way to understand this, right? So bit depth means the number or bits of information within each pixel, right? Every single pixel can represent certain amounts of information. So if you imagine across the matrix, you've got hundreds of these little tiny drawers. What bit depth is how much information can you put in any one of those drawers. Now the way that that ties into what we're doing as X-ray techs is related to the fact that we have the power to see through things. So when I look at things as an X-ray tech, I'm not just seeing what's on the surface. I'm seeing past the surface to the bony anatomy, the soft tissue anatomy, and then the opposite surface as well. The backside of the bony anatomy, the backside of the tissue, right? I'm seeing everything superimposed across the area of imaging. So if my hand is an X-ray, I'm seeing, and this is the patient's body, I'm seeing everything from here to here, right? I'm seeing all of that. All of this is being put in a little pixel drawer. All of those attenuation values that the beam is picking up as it passes through the patient are being dropped in a little pixel drawer on the image receptor matrix. The more we can drop in the drawer, the deeper the pixel bit depth is. The more we can drop in that drawer, the more attenuation values we can express, the greater that bit depth is. So these are basically expressed as gray tones. We work with gray tones. And so, for example, a pixel with a bit depth of 8 or 2 to the 8 has 256 shades of gray that it can represent for any given pixel. Now that's way more shades of gray than the human eye can see, right? Like I can see 30-something shades of gray. This computer can see more shades of gray than I can. So there's more information on any one pixel than the human eye can see, right? So we will come back to that over and over and over again. But just recognize that the computer can see things that you can't, right? The computer can see things that you can't. And the reason it can see those things that we can't see is because of its bit depth. It can store more shades of gray. So this gray level is a factor in determining image contrast resolution. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about contrast resolution right now, but when we talk about it here in a couple of lectures, we'll come back to this bit depth concept. So if I were to try to represent it for the human eye, it looks kind of like this. This is a good illustration of what bit depth kind of looks like. Again, it's not a spatial representation. It has to do with how much information can be stored in any one of those little tiny drawers in our matrix, right? So if it has a bit depth of 1, it can represent 2. It's 2 to the power of 1, so it can represent white or black, right? If it has a bit depth of 2, it's 2 to the power of 2, so 4, it can represent 4 colors, right? So we get a little bit of gray in there. If it has a bit depth of 4 now, it's 2 to the power of 4, more and more and more. It grows exponentially, right? To where eventually we wind up with things that, oh wow, that starts to look continuous to me. That almost looks analog again. It's not. It might appear that way to the human eye, but the computer sees all of these shades of gray. Every last one of them. Even ones that I can't see because of the limitations of the human eye. Now the other thing that controls the size of matrices, right, again, is something that we can relate to. It's more of a physical way of thinking. But in all honesty, the thing that tends to trip students up the most is this, which is kind of weird because I think we get the pixel size thing, if that makes sense. We kind of can get the drawer thing with the pixel bit depth, but then we stumble understanding matrices. So the best way I can think about matrices is really kind of crass and weird, right? But it's the best thing I've come up with, and I call it the pantyhose example. All right. Who here has seen Rocky Horror Picture Show? Right? Good. So pantyhose has a fixed weave size. When I produce a pair of pantyhose in the pantyhose factory, right, I'm producing it with a fixed size to this netting of the pantyhose, right? If it is worn by a person whose leg is the right size, I will not be able to see the weave of the pantyhose, right? But if a man puts on those pantyhose, guess what? They become fishnet stockings really quickly, right? The weave expands. Why? Because I stretched it much bigger than it was meant to be stretched. So what I'm saying about matrices is this. They have a fixed size, right? As I start to try to apply them to larger and larger pieces of anatomy, that fixed size just gets stretched. So the pixels get larger and larger, and now I've got fishnet stockings, right? Now I'm back to that country of the little pixelated skeleton from Minecraft land, right? All the things get clunky looking again. We cannot control matrix size, but matrix size has a big determination on how big or how small those pixels are, right? So a matrix is the square arrangement. It has to be a square. It has to be arranged as X and Y columns, right? And they're numbered columns and rows. So it's a giant square that holds information. For digital imaging purposes, those numbers on the matrix correspond to a specific pixel in there. It corresponds to a specific part of the patient's anatomy, right? So I can call up pixel number like Y12X2, right? And I would land on some pixel there, and I would be able to see what is the gray value at that pixel, right? What is the bit depth at that pixel? So each box corresponds to a specific location on the image, which maps to a specific part of the patient's body, right? So one way to think about it is like a net that catches information about the patient, right? That net has a fixed size. The size of the matrix determines the size of the pixels. So they give an example here. If you have a certain light field size and you project that onto a 512 by 512 matrix, then of those two, the smaller field of view is going to have the smaller pixels. Why? Because the matrix size didn't change. Right? So again, reducing your field of view to just the area imaged is going to allow for you to have smaller pixels. We cannot control that matrix. Here's the part that I think kind of trips people up. The larger the matrix, the larger the image file, right? So what am I saying? If I had a choice between a 512 by 512 matrix versus like a 1024 by 1024 matrix, the 1024 is a larger matrix. What does that mean about the pixel size? There's smaller pixels. Yeah, there's more detail, right? So that's the part that I think trips people up. Matrix and pixel size are inversely related now. As the matrix size gets larger and larger, the pixels are getting smaller and smaller, right? As the images are, this is important. The main reason that's important has to do with archival needs. That basically, it's the reason why a chest x-ray exam, even though it's 2 pictures, has the same spatial requirements on the computer hard drive as a chest CT exam that's 400 pictures, right? The x-ray has a much higher, it has a larger matrix, it requires more storage space. Question?
Okay, so it says here if you have a 10 by 12 and a 14 by 7, and they both have the same thing, the 10 by 12 will have the smaller pixels.
Yes.
If you collimate smaller, will the pixels also go smaller?
Yes. So yes. From what I've read, that is the case, right? That the smaller we collimate, the smaller the field of view, the smaller the pixels are as well. Everything that I've read indicates that. That's definitely true with CT. I definitely know that's true with CT, so I'm going to assume it's also true for X-ray. Good question. So, again, to repeat, reducing your field of view, coning in, reduces patient dose, improves image contrast, and shrinks our pixels so it gives us better spatial resolution. The big reason for all of this is that the image is going to be digitized, right?
Say it again.
I'll say it one more time. So as we cone in on the patient, we are improving patient dose. We're reducing patient dose, right? We are improving image contrast, and we're improving spatial resolution because we're making the pixels smaller. I'll make sure to get that in bold writing on a slide at some point because it's a big takeaway. I think understanding that connects a lot of critical thinking stuff for us as we're talking about digital. Like, I think it relates to a lot of stuff. Moving forward, though, the image is going to be digitized based on position and by intensity. So the easiest way for me to boil these down, like all this pixel and matrix stuff and bit depth stuff, into a single statement is that last statement on this slide. The image is digitized both by position and by the gray value. It's digitized based on the location in the patient's body and the attenuation profile. We can see this, though. We can start to see which of these has the smallest matrix and which of them has the largest matrix. So let's walk through it. Which one of these, we've got A, B, C, or D, which one of them has the smallest matrix? A. A has the smallest matrix. Why? Because it has the largest pixels, right? Which one has the smallest, the largest matrix? It's D. It's difficult to see on this slide, but it has the highest spatial resolution, so it must have the smallest pixels. So good. So of these images, image A has the smallest matrix because it has the largest pixels. It has the poorest spatial resolution. It has the least spatial resolution because it has such large pixels. Image D has the largest matrix because it has the smallest pixels and the highest spatial resolution, the highest high contrast resolution. Here, to go back to Mr. Horner's question, here's the one thing you can control about this. You cannot control matrix size, right? Whatever pantyhose size the pantyhose factory makes, that's what you're getting, right? What you can control is the size of the leg you're putting those pantyhose on, right? You can control the field of view, right? You can control the field of view. So within limits, make sure that you're coning appropriately, because by reducing that field of view, which can also be called the X-ray field or the portal view if you're working in radiation therapy, you're reducing the amount of the patient's body that's included in the image to be digitized. The larger that field of view is, the more information has to be digested down into the matrix, right? So changes in the field of view do not change the matrix. That's one thing that I see students doing sometimes, is they think that as they're changing the field of view, they're growing and shrinking the matrix. No, you're not. To go back to Ms. Thorne's question from earlier, the only way you can change the appearance of that matrix size is to zoom in. Then it will seem that the matrix is growing, or in one case shrinking, so that the pixels get larger.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is one of my biggest things. So if you have, hang on, I just lost it.
Well, I'll move forward, and it'll probably come up in this next slide. So just interrupt me if you need to. Interrupt me the minute it comes back, because we're right on top of a key understanding. So what we're saying is that these three are related: pixel size, matrix size, field of view. Only field of view do we have control over. We're saying they're all related, but there's only one that we can control. So there's a relationship between the size of the pixel, the size of the matrix, and the size of the field of view. The matrix size can be changed without affecting the field of view. So if I move from one imaging system to another imaging system, so say my exam room 1 breaks down, In that exam room 1, that equipment has 1 matrix size, and I'm doing a PA hand, right? I'm like, oh crap, the room went down. Now I'm going to move over from the Fuji machine over to the Siemens. It's a better room anyways. So I cone exactly the same. I did just change the matrix size. When I went from the Fuji room to the Siemens, the Siemens, let's say in this case, has a larger matrix size. So that's an example of changing the matrix size. It would literally have to change out the whole imaging room, right? Because it is hardwired into the equipment. Field of view can be changed without affecting the matrix size. What's an example of that from clinic? Well, let's say I'm in the Siemens room, right? And I realize, oh, well, I coned too much on the PA hand. Let's cone it in a little bit. I just changed the field of view by coning in without changing anything about the matrix. They are not affecting each other, right? But changing either one of those impacts the pixel size, right? So when I coned in, when I reduced the field of view, I reduced the pixel size. When I changed rooms, when I went from the Fuji room to the Siemens room, I reduced the pixel size. All of that is what we're talking about when we talk about spatial resolution. So as you're reading through an exam question, if you see spatial resolution, matrix size, pixel size, field of view, matrix size, pixel size, field of view, the second that I see this stuff, that's where my mind is. It's in the land of how tiny are the dots, how tiny are the cubes, how much information's in those cubes. Okay? This is the ability of a system, of an imaging system, to demonstrate small details of an object. Okay. So dynamic range, which we'll talk about here in just a couple of presentations. The dynamic range, the range of gray values does not equate to a higher spatial resolution. That equates to a higher contrast resolution. What equates to a higher spatial resolution is just smaller pixels. Doing things that create smaller pixels, whether we're buying equipment that's got the largest matrix possible, or we're using appropriate field of views for our imaging so that we're reducing pixel size because we're limiting the field of view to just the area to be examined. All right. Thank you all so much.